Well, on this Eternity Sunday, we are continuing our look at the accounts that we read in the book of Revelation as we continue towards eternity. We're thankful that God has won the battle for us. He has won the victory for us. We know that we have the assurance of eternal life, and so we're looking at the events that are coming as we see God's ultimate victory here on earth. We're getting close to the end of our study here. And so let's just review for a minute where we were the last time we looked at this. In the previous chapter, we saw a picture of how Jesus is going to return to earth. And we saw two images of that. One, it talked about the marriage feast of the Lamb. And so Jesus was the bridegroom, and the church was the bride. And so there's that image of the wedding feast coming. There's going to be a unity that comes together as Jesus returns and claims his bride, the church. And then the image changed to the church being the army of Jesus, and Jesus going into battle against the enemy, returning as a conqueror. And John saw a picture of how Jesus was going to destroy the Antichrist, the false prophet, and all the nations and armies that would follow them. And we saw how he would do it all himself. Even though he had his army around in the church, Jesus won that battle single-handedly without anyone else having to even pick up a weapon. As we get into chapter 20 now, we see it first talking about the 1,000-year reign of Jesus. And as with lots of other ideas I've talked about in Revelation, there's differing ideas, differing theories of what sort of these things mean. This 1,000-year reign is something that differing people have different opinions on. And there's three main schools of thought on this 1,000-year, or this millennial reign. They are premillennialism, postmillennialism, and amillennialism. A premillennialist would say that Jesus will return and have a literal 1,000-year reign here on earth. It'll be literal, it'll be physical, where Jesus will be here and he will reign. That during this time, Satan is going to be bound. Satan will not be able to tempt or turn anyone away from their faith in Jesus. And those who have already died in their faith in Jesus, because of their faith in Jesus, will be raised to life, and they will reign with Jesus during this time. Postmillennial thinking says that this 1,000-year reign isn't actually an earthly reign. That it's a heavenly reign where Jesus will reign in heaven. And then once that 1,000-year reign in heaven is over, then Jesus will return to earth in a physical way. And it too says that Satan will be bound, and it'll bring a golden age to the church where the church will be able to thrive because Satan is not active. Satan is bound. And then when Jesus finally does return, that will be when he defeats Satan once and for all. The amillennial view says that the 1,000-year reign isn't really a literal 1,000 years, but it's symbolic. And there are amillennialists that say that we're actually living in that time now, that millennial age right now. And it will come to an end when Jesus does return. If pressed on which one of those camps I would fall into, I would tend towards the premillennial. Because it really seems when we read back chapter 19 and chapter 20 here, it seems that's the way it falls. That Jesus returns, he claims the church to himself, he defeats the Antichrist and the prophet, and then it says we move into this 1,000-year reign. And it looks as if it's going to be an earthly reign. In this passage that we looked at, there's two resurrections that take place as well. And the first we see in this 1,000-year reign. When Jesus does return, it says that those who have died in him, those believers who have died, they're going to be raised back to life. And it's going to be a life that they'll be able to reign in that whole 1,000 years with Jesus. It says that those who are resurrected aren't going to need to fear the second death. And so in the same way that maybe Jesus was raised, as Jesus was raised, he had a glorified body when he was raised to life again. We see that after Jesus died and was raised to life, he did things that he didn't do before. He could appear in buildings, he could suddenly appear and disappear. And so he had even though his body had died, and it was in appearance the same, it was a glorified body. So maybe when these Believers who have died are resurrected. They will be in the same way, but their bodies will not experience death in that way anymore. We see also that those who died because of their faith, who died testifying to Jesus, they'll be given special honor in that place as well. And then it says that there's going to be a second resurrection. This is just the resurrection of believers, of those who are following Jesus, and then there'll be a second resurrection that will happen later on. But it really describes how this 1,000-year reign is going to be an incredibly wonderful time. As horrible as the tribulation period was, as difficult as that was for believers, as tragic as that was, this reign of Jesus, where Jesus will be present, where he'll be in authority, where Satan will be bound and unable to operate. It'll be an incredible time, and we can imagine it'll be a time where many people will come to put their faith and understand who Jesus really is. But we're warned at the beginning of this that this time where Satan is bound, it will come to an end of that 1,000 years, and it says for a little while he'll be loosed. And we start to see that starting in verse 7 to 10. At the end of this millennial age of this 1,000 years, Satan is set loose. And it says he immediately begins to deceive nations again. Even though Jesus will be here, he'll be ruling. It's obvious that not all have given their hearts and their lives to him. There are still some of those that will be deceived. And Satan gathers those people to himself. Later on, we see that he begins to gather these people and he forms an army. And we see the names Gog and Magog there. And again, these are I think, symbols. The prophet Ezekiel used these two same names, Gog and Magog. And in that context, Gog was the king of this place, Magog. And it was a nation that was warring against Israel. So I think these names are symbolic of this army that Satan is going to raise up, and he's going to try and defeat Jesus and his army. And we see that Satan, once released, once free to deceive again, once free to gather people and a nation and an army to himself, it says he surrounds God's people and surrounds the beloved city, which would be Jerusalem. But then in verses 9 and 10, we see that Satan and his armies will be defeated, and for the second time without anyone having to pick up a weapon. It says fire from heaven will come down and will consume the army, and Satan himself, once and for all, will be defeated. In verses 11 to 15, we read about what some call the great white seat of judgment. And then we see this second resurrection. Those believers who have already died have been raised to life with Jesus, and now everyone else who has died is raised to life, and the judgment begins. When I was reading this, I really read something that initially didn't ring right with me. There was something that didn't seem right. Because we see in verse 12, we see it saying, "And the dead were judged according to what they had done." And again, later on, it says in verse 13, "And all were judged according to their deeds." And as I read that it didn't seem to ring true with me, because, we think of salvation as being something that we can't earn. We can't do anything to earn our salvation. We're not good enough by ourselves to do it. But as I stopped and thought about that a little bit more, I think I understand what it's saying. It's we can't do anything to earn our salvation. But everyone, all of us, will be judged based on what we do. Because it says that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We all have sin in us. And so when we stand before the throne, when we stand before judgment, God will look at our lives. He'll look at our deeds. And he'll see that in and of ourselves we aren't worthy, we aren't able to be saved. But as we've said yes to Jesus, and as we've accepted his gift and his sacrifice, then our names are written in that book of life that it talks about. And even though in ourselves we don't have what it takes, our deeds don't match up, it'll say beside our names, paid for by Jesus. And so while our salvation comes through God's mercy, and it's a gift, a free gift that we earn through faith, the judgment that takes place will be a judgment of works. It'll be a judgment of, were you worthy? Is there sin in your life? And if a person comes to that throne with sin in their life that has not been forgiven, has not been paid for already by Jesus, then they will be judged for that. And so we're looking into these things, and we don't have to look at them with a sense of fear or hope, or fear or despair. We can have hope, because we know that Jesus has won this victory for us already. We know that as we have said yes to Jesus, and if we say yes to Jesus, then our names are written in that book of life. That we don't need to fear this judgment seat. Because when we think of judgment seat, when we think about the final judgment, it can be something that can make us anxious. It's something that we don't maybe want to even think about. But we don't need to fear it. We don't need to fear what our life will look like after this life on earth is over. Because Jesus has won the victory. Because Jesus has laid down his life to pay the price for our sin, your sin and my sin. We don't have to think about that judgment seat with a sense of fear. We can feel thankful and hopeful about that final judgment because we have the assurance that Jesus has won the victory and that we are in him. As we celebrate this Eternity Sunday, where we remember those who have passed away, who have gone ahead of us, I think we can come at it for the same perspective of remembrance, but also a perspective of thanksgiving, and hold those things hand in hand. Because we don't have to fear judgment. We do have the hope of eternal life. As we have lost loved ones in this world, there might be a time of separation in the here and now. But because of our eternal hope in Jesus, we have the hope of a reunion that is ahead.